snow-covered crime. The small, dimly lit cafe hummed with the quiet chatter of patrons, the clink of coffee cups, and the hiss of the espresso machine. Gloria McAllister sat across from Nick Velvet, her eyes fixed on him with the intensity of someone who knew there was more to the story than what appeared on the surface. She was no ordinary journalist. Sharp, inquisitive, and relentless, Gloria had heard the rumors about Nick, the so-called cunning thief who was notorious for stealing seemingly meaningless items. But she wasn't just interested in the stolen goods. She was after the truth, and something told her that Nick Velvet wasn't just another criminal. Nick sat back in his chair, swirling the dark liquid in his cup, his lips curved into a knowing smile. He was a man of mystery, tall, with sharp features that seemed to hide behind a perpetual smirk. His eyes gleamed, reflecting a sharpness that matched his reputation. But it was the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence and a sense of mischief, that made Gloria wonder if there was more to him than met the eye. "Nick," she began, leaning forward slightly, her voice low but curious. "Why do you steal such peculiar things? It doesn't make sense." Nick's smirk widened as he took a slow sip of his espresso. He set the cup down gently, as if savoring the moment before delivering his usual cryptic response. "That's because I don't steal for money, Gloria," he said, his voice smooth and casual. "I steal for the challenge. Like snow from a hill in the dead of winter." Gloria's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She leaned back in her chair, almost incredulous. "Snow? In Canada? You're joking." Nick's gaze locked onto hers, a glint of mischief dancing in his eyes. "I never joke, Gloria. Everything I do has a purpose. Every item I take is a puzzle, a challenge. And when the challenge is completed, the thrill is enough for me." Gloria was quiet for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had heard the stories, the bizarre accounts of Nick's heists. He had stolen things like an old coin from a coin collection, an empty bottle from a wine cellar, and once, a rare antique spoon that no one seemed to care about. What was the point of these seemingly pointless thefts? Was there a deeper meaning behind them, or was it all just a game to Nick? "What's the real story here, Nick?" Gloria asked, her voice softer now, probing. "You're not just a thief. There's something more to you. Something different." Nick leaned forward, his expression turning more serious for a moment. He looked at her with an intensity that made Gloria's heart skip a beat. "You're right," he said quietly. "But you're not going to like the answer." Gloria's curiosity was piqued even further. "Try me." Nick's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the air around them seemed to shift. The cafe noise faded into the background, and all that mattered in that instant was the quiet tension between them. "Do you know anything about the Canadian government's secretive operations?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gloria felt a chill run down her spine. The Canadian government? Secret operations? She had read the rumors, the whispers about government agents, covert operations, and undercover agents working in the shadows. Was Nick one of them? "I've heard things," Gloria replied, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "But nothing concrete. What does that have to do with you?" Nick's eyes twinkled with a secretive smile. "I'm not just a thief, Gloria. I'm an agent. A very unconventional one, if you will." Gloria blinked, momentarily speechless. The man sitting across from her, the man who had been stealing odd, seemingly useless items for years, was a government agent? She couldn't quite process the revelation. It was absurd and yet somehow plausible. "You're saying that you've been stealing these things for the government?" Gloria asked, her voice incredulous. "But why? What's the point of stealing a single coin or an empty bottle?" Nick chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the confusion on her face. "Because, my dear, it's not about the coin or the bottle. It's about the network, the people behind the objects. Each item I take leads me to someone somewhere. Every theft is a breadcrumb, a piece of a larger puzzle. The items I steal aren't just valuable, they're connected to something bigger." Gloria leaned forward, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "So, You're saying the Canadian government sends you on these missions, but they're disguised as random thefts? Nick's grin returned, full of confidence. Exactly. No one suspects a thief of being a spy, and no one suspects a spy of being a thief. I slip in, grab what I need, and disappear before anyone knows what happened. Gloria sat back, her mind racing. This was a story unlike anything she had ever encountered. Nick Velvet, the cunning thief, was actually an undercover agent for the Canadian government, and his heists were part of a much larger, covert operation. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Gloria knew this was just the beginning. There were so many questions left unanswered. So, what's the next challenge? Gloria asked, her voice steady but laced with intrigue. Nick's eyes flickered with excitement. That's the beauty of it, Gloria. There's always a next challenge. Always another puzzle to solve. And I'm just getting started. With that, the conversation drifted into silence, but the air between them crackled with unspoken understanding. Gloria knew that she had just uncovered a small piece of a much bigger story. Nick Velvet was a man of many secrets, and she was determined to uncover them all. The clink of a spoon against a coffee cup echoed through the cafe, but for Gloria, it was the sound of a new story unfolding, one that would change everything she thought she knew about Nick Velvet, and perhaps even about the world itself. The wind in Montreal howled outside the small cafe where Nick Velvet sat, the frosty chill seeping through the windows despite the heat inside. He had just finished another quiet coffee meeting with Gloria McAllister, her sharp eyes still studying him, trying to figure out if his reputation was a result of pure talent, or if there was something more to his mysterious heists. Just as the conversation was winding down, Nick's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, an eyebrow arched in curiosity. The name on the caller ID made him sit up straight. Paul Gasper, one of the wealthiest and most eccentric businessmen in Montreal. Nick had heard his name tossed around at some of the more exclusive gatherings in the city. Gasper had built his fortune through a chain of luxury ski resorts, but he had a reputation for dealing with problems in unconventional ways. Nick Velvet, he answered, his voice smooth but with a slight edge. To what do I owe the pleasure? I'll make it simple. Gasper's voice came through the phone, calm but urgent. I need you for a job. A rather unusual one. I'll pay you $20,000 to move snow from one hill to another. Nick blinked in disbelief. Snow? It was winter after all, and snow was practically a commodity in Montreal. But this was ridiculous. Snow, Paul? What's the catch? There was a pause on the other end, and Nick could hear a subtle shift in Gasper's tone. The usual businesslike charm faded into something more serious, almost desperate. It's not just snow, it's leverage, Gasper explained, his voice lowering, as though he were speaking to someone who needed to understand the gravity of the situation. Without it, my winter business goes under. I'm relying on you to pull this off. You're the only one who can do it. Nick sat back, his mind already racing. Leverage? What kind of leverage did Snow hold? This wasn't just a theft, not a regular heist with valuable artifacts or cash, but a task that was oddly specific. But Nick wasn't one to turn down a challenge, especially when a figure like Gasper, with so much at stake, was asking for his help. All right, Nick finally replied, his voice calm. I'll need more details before I decide to get involved. Gasper's voice came back quickly, his urgency evident. I'll send you the coordinates. You'll meet my people in the next few days. Just make sure you have the right equipment. We're talking about a serious operation here. You can't just shovel snow in a few hours and call it a job done. If you don't move it right, we lose everything. Do you understand? I'll be ready, Nick replied coolly, his mind already working through the logistics. He could already see it, a challenge, something he couldn't resist. Moving snow wasn't just about shifting piles of white fluff. It was a puzzle. And if it was truly as important as Gasper made it sound, there were layers to this job. Nick was already calculating the risks, weighing the reward. As he hung up the phone, his thoughts briefly flickered to Gloria, sitting across the table, watching him intently. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice casual but curious, her eyes never leaving his. Nick glanced at her, a slight smirk curling at the edges of his lips. "Business," he said simply. "I've got a job to do in Montreal." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced by the lack of detail. "You're going to Montreal? What, another heist?" Nick chuckled, leaning back in his chair, thoroughly enjoying the playful tension between them. "Well, I guess you could say I'm stealing snow." "Stealing snow?" Gloria laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "What's next? Stealing the ice from an ice sculpture?" Nick's grin widened as he reached for his coat, preparing to leave the cafe. "You can't steal snow without staying warm," he quipped, zipping up a thick sweater and tossing the strap of his bag over his shoulder. He wasn't about to give her all the details, not yet, but she could tell there was something more to this job than met the eye. Gloria's eyes narrowed slightly, the wheels turning in her head. "This doesn't sound like your usual kind of job, Nick. I thought you were into stealing things that had some kind of value." "Everything has value," Nick said, his voice low and serious now. "You just have to know what to look for." Gloria hesitated, clearly curious, but still unsure. She stood up, gathering her things. "You're not the only one who can solve puzzles, Nick. If you ever feel like sharing the rest of the story, I'll be here." Nick gave her a wink, his grin never faltering. "I'll be in touch, Gloria. Don't worry. You'll get the story, just not yet." With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Gloria staring after him, more intrigued than ever. The cold Montreal air hit him like a slap in the face as he stepped outside. It wasn't just a chill, it was the promise of something different. Snow, yes, but not just any snow. This was a job unlike anything he had done before. The coordinates Gasper had sent him would lead him to one of his luxury ski resorts, and there Nick would begin what could only be described as an operation that was as much about precision as it was about strategy. Moving snow, a concept that was almost absurd in its simplicity, but that was what made it all the more intriguing. As he made his way to the hotel, Nick's mind worked through the details. There were no simple jobs in his world, and this one was no different. He would need to be meticulous calculating. He would have to move the snow in just the right way, and more importantly, he would have to uncover what Gasper meant by leverage. The answers weren't clear, but the challenge was enough to get his blood pumping. There was more to this than simply relocating snow. He could feel it in his bones, that familiar rush that came when a job promised to be more than it appeared. As the lights of the hotel lobby flickered to life in front of him, he was already preparing for the next phase of the game. He would uncover the truth, and along the way, he would turn the tables. Nick Velvet didn't do things halfway. He did them to win. The plane touched down with a gentle thud on the icy runway of IFFI, a remote region just outside Montreal. The vast expanse of snow-covered hills stretched out before Nick Velvet, the landscape as pristine and untouched as any winter wonderland could be. But Nick didn't see it as beauty. He saw it as an opportunity, a challenge. The cold air bit at his face as he stepped off the small plane and onto the snow, his boots crunching on the frost beneath him. Paul Gasper was waiting for him, his tall figure framed against the white backdrop, a dark silhouette against the blinding expanse. He was bundled up against the cold, his breath visible in the sharp winter air. "Nick, welcome to IFFI," Gasper greeted, his voice both eager and tense. "This is the place. The snow you need to move is all around you. Perfect, untouched waiting." Nick surveyed the rolling hills, the snow deep and untouched by any sign of human interference. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear, where a challenge could rise up from the quiet and the cold. This area's untouched by the sun, perfect for ice making, Gasper explained, gesturing expansively toward the vast stretches of snow-covered land. He sounded almost as if he were showing Nick a treasure map. Nick's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, already calculating in his mind the logistics of the job. He had been a master at handling the impossible for years, but this This was a different animal altogether. "It'll take 200 truckloads," Nick said, his voice low and measured. "And your bulldozer better be ready." Gasper nodded, though his face shifted for a moment, betraying some concern. "That's the plan," Gasper replied, his gaze following Nick's as the thief turned his eyes back to the terrain. "But Nick, there's one problem." Nick didn't take his eyes off the snow. "What's the problem?" Gasper hesitated, taking a deep breath. "The Admiral owns that hill," he said slowly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "And he's not exactly cooperative. He's a stubborn man, Nick. He won't let anyone just come in here and move snow without a fight." Nick's lips curled into a wry smile as he glanced up at Gasper. "The Admiral, huh? Well, I've handled tougher situations than this. Don't worry. The snow will be yours." Gasper stared at him, the anxiety in his eyes obvious. "I'm not so sure, Nick. This man is, well, he's not the type you can charm or talk down. He's got his own agenda, and trust me, he'll fight for what he believes is his." Nick chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with a mix of confidence and mischief. "I didn't come all the way out here for a nice walk through the snow, Paul. You want the snow moved. You need me to do what I do best. And I don't just move snow." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I move people. And if I need to, I'll move your Admiral, too." Gasper stared at him, a moment of doubt creeping into his expression before he nodded, albeit reluctantly. "You're sure? He's got a lot of people behind him. If you want this done, you'll have to deal with him first." Nick's smile widened as he gave a small nod, surveying the snow-covered hills once more. "Don't worry about me. I'll deal with your Admiral. You'll get your snow." Gasper didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder at the distant hill, where the Admiral's land began. Nick knew the man was a force to be reckoned with in the region, powerful, entrenched in the local business community, and well-protected. But Nick was used to challenges like this. People like the Admiral didn't scare him. They were just another puzzle to solve, another obstacle to navigate. "I've arranged a meeting with him," Gasper finally said, snapping Nick out of his thoughts. "It's in his cabin just up the hill." Nick nodded without a word and turned, making his way through the snow toward the small gathering of men and equipment that had been set up to start the job. He could already picture how things would go down. If there was one thing he knew, it was how to read a situation before it even unfolded. The Admiral's stubbornness would be his greatest asset. A man like that didn't know how to back down, and Nick would use that to his advantage. People like the Admiral were predictable. They always tried to control the situation, thinking they had the upper hand. That was when Nick was at his best. Gasper hesitated for a moment before following him, his footsteps crunching in the deep snow. "I don't know, Nick. This is a big risk. If this doesn't go as planned..." "It'll go as planned," Nick interrupted, his voice steady. "I've never failed yet." Gasper seemed to hold his breath, but Nick didn't give him a chance to speak further. They arrived at the Admiral's cabin after a short walk, the path winding through the snowy forest, the cold air pressing in from all sides. The cabin itself was a sturdy log structure, isolated from the rest of the world, a fortress against the relentless winter winds. As they approached, Nick could feel the tension thick in the air. The Admiral was waiting inside, no doubt watching from behind drawn curtains. Nick knocked firmly on the door, his presence commanding and sure. The door creaked open to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his face weathered by years of exposure to the harsh climate. The Admiral's eyes were sharp, calculating, and immediately, Nick knew he would be a formidable adversary. "You must be Velvet," the Admiral said gruffly, his gaze sizing Nick up. "What makes you think you can come in here and take what's mine?" Nick smiled, his eyes never leaving the Admiral's. "Because, sir, I don't ask for permission. I make my own way. And right now that means moving your snow." The Admiral stared at him, a moment of silence passing between them. Then, slowly, He stepped aside and motioned for Nick and Gasper to enter. The game had begun, and Nick was already 3 moves ahead. The Admiral's mansion stood at the top of a hill, its towering silhouette cutting against the gray winter sky like a fortress. The house was old, grand, and imposing, the windows frosted over as though trying to hide the secrets it contained. A bitter wind swept across the snow-covered grounds as Nick Velvet approached, his boots crunching softly against the frozen earth. He glanced up at the mansion, his expression unreadable, but his mind was already working. There were answers here, he was sure of it. Answers to why the Admiral was so adamant about the snow and why Gasper had felt the need to involve him. Nick wasn't one for subtlety when it came to his work, but in this case, it was important. He needed to get inside the Admiral's world, to see what made him tick, and to find out what exactly the Admiral was hiding. Feigning casual interest, Nick adjusted his scarf and approached the massive wooden door. Before he could knock, it swung open, revealing a young woman who stood in the doorway. Her hair was dark, tied back in a neat bun, and her eyes were a striking shade of green, a soft warmth in them despite the chill of the air. She wore an elegant, simple dress that seemed out of place in the harsh Canadian winter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her French-Canadian accent lilting through the air, her voice soft yet direct. Nick flashed her a charming smile, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "I heard the Admiral owns some fascinating artifacts," he said, his tone casual but purposeful. "I'd love to see them." The woman's eyes flickered with interest. There was something about Nick's demeanor that was immediately disarming. It was as if he had a way of making anyone feel like they were part of a game. He wasn't just a visitor. He was someone who belonged. She studied him for a brief moment, her lips curving into a soft smile. "You're curious, aren't you?" she said, her tone softer now, as though she had decided he wasn't a threat. "All right, but don't upset him. He's particular about visitors." Nick nodded, his smile never fading. "I'll be on my best behavior," he said, his voice laced with a hint of humor. He gave her a slight bow, playing the part of the polite guest. "I promise, I'm just here to admire his collection." Marion hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing Nick to enter. As he crossed the threshold, he couldn't help but take in the grandiose interior. The walls were adorned with dark wood panels, old portraits hung in gilded frames, and the faint scent of polished leather and aged books filled the air. This was a house of secrets, and Nick could feel it with every step he took. "Follow me," Marion said, leading him down a long corridor, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet mansion. They passed through several rooms, libraries, sitting areas, each more lavish than the last. But it wasn't the decor that caught Nick's attention. It was the silence. The air seemed thick with unspoken history, each room hiding something more than it let on. Eventually, they reached a large wooden door at the end of the hall. Marion opened it slowly, and Nick followed her into a room filled with displays of curiosities, artifacts from all over the world. Shelves lined the walls, each one packed with treasures, ancient weapons, delicate porcelain figurines, and mysterious relics that seemed to have stories of their own. The room was dimly lit, but the faint glow of candlelight made the items appear even more mysterious. Before Nick could comment on the collection, a deep voice rumbled from the far corner of the room. "Artifacts, you say?" Nick turned to see the Admiral standing near a massive fireplace, the flames casting shadows on his rugged face. The man was gruff, dressed in a naval jacket that seemed almost too formal for the setting. His presence was commanding, like that of a man who had seen and done things most people would never dare imagine. The Admiral's gaze locked onto Nick's, studying him with a quiet intensity. "Come, let me show you something extraordinary," the Admiral said, his tone gruff but inviting, as if he were accustomed to giving tours of his treasures to select visitors. Nick's interest piqued, but he kept his face neutral, careful not to show too much excitement. The Admiral was clearly a man who relished control, and Nick needed to play this carefully. The Admiral walked to a nearby display case and opened it with a soft creak. Inside was an ornate box, its surface etched with intricate designs. The box seemed almost out of place among the other artifacts, which were mostly antiques or historical items. This one, however, seemed to pulse with its own significance. Nick couldn't help but feel drawn to it. "This is a piece from the ancient world," the Admiral explained, his voice dropping into a more reverent tone. "It's set to hold the key to a long-forgotten mystery. My father found it on a journey through the farthest reaches of the globe. It's not something I show to just anyone." Nick studied the box intently. He knew the game here. The Admiral wasn't just showing him a relic. He was testing him. This was a man who placed value not only on his possessions, but on the way people interacted with them. He wanted to see how Nick would respond. "It's beautiful," Nick said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "I can see why you keep it hidden. It must have a powerful history." The Admiral's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and suspicion. "You understand," he said, nodding slowly. "You're not like the others. You can appreciate what true value is." Nick gave a slight smile, nodding politely. He could feel the weight of the conversation shifting, the tension thickening in the air. The Admiral was revealing something important, but Nick knew there was more to this story. The artifacts, the snow, the power behind the man, there was a deeper connection, something that tied it all together. But for now he needed to keep his cards close to his chest. As the Admiral continued to speak, Nick's mind raced, fitting the pieces together. Gasper had been right to involve him. The Admiral was a man of secrets, and Nick Velvet was more than ready to uncover them. Marion stood off to the side, watching them both, her expression unreadable. Nick couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she let on. She had welcomed him into the mansion with little more than a smile, but there was something behind her eyes, something that said she, too, was part of this intricate web of mysteries. The Admiral's voice broke through Nick's thoughts. "I'll show you more, but I warn you, there are things here that even I don't fully understand." Nick's smile widened, his curiosity growing with every word. "I'm here to learn, Admiral," he said smoothly, "and I have a feeling I'll be learning a lot more than I expected." The game was on, and Nick Velvet was ready to play. The Admiral led Nick down a narrow hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath their feet. The mansion seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with secret rooms and hidden passageways. The air was thick with the scent of old books and something far less comforting, an almost tangible sense of mystery. They reached another door, and the Admiral opened it with a smooth motion, revealing a dimly lit room that looked more like a private museum than a living space. The walls were lined with glass cases, each one containing bizarre and unsettling objects, shrunken heads, ancient ceremonial masks, and various oddities that spoke of dark histories and forgotten rituals. The room felt oppressive, as if the very air in here held the weight of centuries of secrets. Nick stepped into the room, his eyes immediately scanning the various exhibits. He didn't show a flicker of surprise on his face, but inside his mind was already piecing together the significance of each item. The heads, twisted and grotesque in their preserved state, seemed almost alive in the dim light, their glassy eyes staring out, eternally frozen in their last moments. "Impressive," Nick remarked, his voice calm and almost bored as he gestured to a case containing the shrunken head of what appeared to be a warrior. "I've seen collections like this before, but these have a certain quality to them." The Admiral gave a small nod, clearly pleased by the compliment. "This collection took years to gather. You wouldn't believe how difficult it is to get your hands on something this rare," he said, his voice tinged with pride. But there was an edge to it, a subtle warning. "These aren't just curiosities, Mr. Velvet. They're part of my heritage." Nick gave him an interested look, but didn't say anything right away. He stepped closer to another case, his fingers just brushing against the glass as he examined a series of strange, intricately carved totems. The more he looked, the more he felt that this room wasn't just about relics. It was about control. The Admiral had built this room as his personal kingdom, a place where the power he wielded over these objects extended to the very people who entered. Nick could tell the man relished the mystery and danger they exuded. It was a clear reflection of the Admiral himself, a man who thrived on secrecy, on power, and on the illusion of invincibility. Nick took a step back, keeping his hands to himself, but his gaze was sharp, searching for something more beneath the surface. "But I hear you also own the best snow in Mullifa," he said casually, as if he were talking about an old car or a favorite restaurant. The Admiral's face immediately darkened. The shift in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. His lips tightened, and his eyes narrowed in a way that made Nick's senses sharpen. "That snow isn't for sale," the Admiral said, his voice low and icy. The statement was final, as if he were closing off the subject, but Nick wasn't about to back down. Nick tilted his head slightly, an amused smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "You misunderstand me, Admiral," he said smoothly. "I'm not interested in buying it. I'm interested in moving it." The Admiral let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "I think you've misunderstood the situation entirely, Mr. Velvet." He stepped closer, his presence becoming even more imposing in the dim light. "You can't just move snow, not the way I'm talking about. And if you think you can, you're gravely mistaken." Nick leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though his demeanor remained calm and collected. "What if I told you I could make it worth your while?" he said, his eyes locking with the Admiral's. "What if I could offer you something that would make this snow more valuable than you could ever imagine? Something that could change the way you look at it?" For a moment, the Admiral said nothing, his cold, calculating gaze fixed on Nick, as if he were measuring the man in front of him. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with tension. It was clear that the Admiral was considering the proposition, weighing his options. Finally, he broke the silence with a dark laugh. "You'd need more than a silver tongue to convince me, Mr. Velvet," the Admiral said, his voice almost mocking, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes now. "You don't understand, do you? This snow isn't some ordinary commodity. It's not something that can be moved or sold. It's part of something much bigger, something that I've spent my life guarding." Nick's smile didn't waver. He wasn't the type to be intimidated, and the Admiral's posturing was just another game to him. "I'm not here to sell snow, Admiral," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to show you something that could make it worth more than you could ever imagine. Something that could put you in a position of power even greater than the one you think you have now." The Admiral narrowed his eyes, his fingers twitching slightly, as if he were about to take action. But instead, he just studied Nick with an intensity that was almost palpable. "You think you know everything about power, Velvet?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with disdain. "You're just a thief. Nothing more. You steal things that are of no value to anyone else, but that doesn't make you a player in this world. You're just a pawn." Nick stepped back, letting out a low chuckle. "Maybe I am, Admiral, but every pawn has its use." He paused, his eyes gleaming with an unspoken promise. "And sometimes, even pawns can change the course of the game." The Admiral's lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with unspoken tension. The Admiral's collection of oddities, the shrunken heads, the artifacts from 1,000 forgotten lands, all of it felt like it was closing in on Nick, pressing him into the corner. But that was exactly how he liked it. The more pressure there was, the more the game became interesting. Finally, the Admiral broke the silence with a single, chilling word. "Leave." Nick didn't flinch. He had expected the response, but he didn't let the man see his reaction. With a polite nod, he turned to leave, his footsteps echoing through the room as he walked toward the door. "I'll be back, Admiral," Nick said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "And when I return, I think you'll be more willing to listen." The Admiral didn't respond, but Nick could feel his eyes burning into his back as he left the room. He wasn't sure how, but he knew one thing for certain: he had planted the seed. And soon enough, that seed would sprout, and the Admiral would come to him. The question was not if, but when. Nick stepped out of the Admiral's mansion, the heavy door closing with a soft thud behind him. The weight of the secrets he'd just unearthed lingered in the air, and as he walked down the snow-covered path, the wind biting at his face, he felt the familiar rush of anticipation that always followed when a job was nearing its peak. His mind was already racing with plans: how to move the snow, how to deal with the Admiral, how to turn the tables to his advantage. He was a thief, yes, but also a master tactician. And this was shaping up to be one of his most intriguing heists yet. As he approached the gate, ready to make his escape, he heard footsteps crunching behind him in the snow. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The soft, almost hesitant sound of Marian's steps told him everything. "Nick, wait," she called out, her voice carrying through the frosty air. He stopped, half turning, his eyes narrowing with interest. He hadn't expected her to follow him, let alone speak to him again. From the moment they'd met, she'd been a mystery, an enigma wrapped in elegance, with eyes that watched everything but never gave anything away. There had been something in her gaze earlier, something that suggested she knew more than she let on. And now, as she caught up to him, Nick could sense she was about to reveal something crucial. Marian's eyes flickered nervously as she approached, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. There was a wariness in her posture, as though she knew what she was about to say would have consequences. "You're not fooling anyone," she said bluntly, her voice surprisingly firm for someone who had seemed so polite earlier. Nick raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? And what exactly am I up to then?" Marian's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't playing games anymore. "You're here for the snow," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with concern. "But the Admiral won't give it up easily. Be careful." Nick's expression softened into a half-smile, though there was something calculating in his gaze. "Thanks for the advice," he said. "But I've handled worse." Marian hesitated, her eyes scanning the landscape as if she were weighing whether to reveal more. The cold wind swept through the trees, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. She finally spoke again, her voice lower this time, as though she were sharing a secret. "The snow isn't just snow, Nick," she said, her eyes locking with his. "It's part of something bigger, something that could destroy you if you're not careful. The Admiral is not someone you want to cross, especially when it comes to this. He doesn't give up easily, and when he feels threatened, he won't hesitate to do whatever it takes." Nick's smile faltered just slightly, but his curiosity was piqued. He had known there was more to this than the simple job that Gasper had presented him with, but this was a different level of complication. Marian's warning wasn't just a casual piece of advice. She seemed genuinely concerned. "What exactly are you saying?" Nick asked, his voice softening slightly as he studied her face. He could tell she wasn't just speaking out of fear for herself. There was something personal in her warning, something deeper that tied her to this whole situation. Marian bit her lip, clearly conflicted. "I don't want to see you get hurt," she said quietly. "I've seen what the Admiral does to people who cross him. He's ruthless. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his interests. And the snow? It's not just for his business. It's something he's been guarding for years. You won't be the first person to try and take it from him, but if you think you can just waltz in and walk away with it, you're wrong." Nick's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak right away. There was more to this than he had initially thought, and for once he found himself listening intently. He had dealt with powerful people, men who wielded influence, who had armies of enforcers at their disposal. But this was different. The snow, the way Marian spoke of it, made it clear that there was something extraordinary about it, a significance that went beyond business or wealth. "I'm not the kind of man who backs down easily, Marian," Nick said, his voice steady. "And the snow? Well, let's just say I have a way of getting what I want." Marian's eyes softened with a touch of sympathy, but her tone remained firm. "I know you're good at what you do, Nick. But the Admiral? He's not a man who can be outsmarted easily. I've seen it happen before. People think they can outwit him, and they end up paying the price. You're playing a dangerous game, and I'm just trying to warn you before you go too far." Nick was silent for a moment, considering her words. The threat in her voice wasn't just about the snow or the Admiral. It was personal. He could sense it. But what was her connection to all this? Why did she care so much? "Why are you helping me, Marion?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. "What's in it for you?" Marion's gaze flickered with something unreadable, and for a moment, Nick wondered if she would avoid the question altogether. But she didn't. She met his gaze and spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper. "Because I don't want to see anyone else get hurt," she said, her words carrying a weight that made Nick pause. "I've seen what the Admiral does to people who get too close, and I don't want you to be another one of those people." Nick's eyes softened just a fraction. He wasn't used to people caring about him, especially not someone like Marion. But there was something in her voice, something raw and real, that made him trust her more than he usually would. He didn't know her story, but he could tell that she wasn't just another pawn in the Admiral's game. She had her own reasons for being here, and those reasons ran deep. "All right," Nick said finally, his smile returning, though it was more genuine this time. "You've got my attention. What's the plan?" Marion looked around cautiously, as if making sure they were alone. "Meet me tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll show you a back way to the hill, one that the Admiral doesn't know about. If you're serious about this, it's the only way you'll stand a chance." Nick nodded, his mind already working, calculating the possibilities. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "I'll be there." As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Marion, the storm clouds of uncertainty swirling in his mind. She had just offered him the key to the next step of his plan, but there was still something about her that didn't quite add up. What was she hiding? Why had she chosen to help him? One thing was certain, he was getting closer to the truth. And Marion, whether she knew it or not, was about to become an unexpected ally in his quest for the snow. The cold wind bit at Nick's face as he and Marion trekked through the snow-covered hills outside IFFI. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. The air was crisp, the silence deafening, save for the soft crunch of their boots in the snow. The world around them felt frozen in time, and it was the perfect cover for what they were about to do. Nick moved with the precision of a seasoned professional, his eyes scanning the area as he marked off the section of the hill where the bulldozers would soon begin their work. The snow here was thick and untouched, just the way he'd been told it would be. Gasper's business depended on this snow, and Nick had been hired to move it. Though with all the layers of secrecy, it felt more like he was stepping into a high-stakes game than pulling off a simple heist. Marion, ever watchful, stood a few feet away, her eyes darting across the darkened landscape. The cold didn't seem to bother her as much as it did Nick. There was something about her, something that told him she was used to being out in the elements. She kept a hand on her coat, pulling it tighter around her, as if she could will the warmth back into her body. "This feels like a movie," she whispered, her voice barely above the wind. Nick smirked, his breath visible in the cold night air. He glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression a mix of amusement and focus. "Just wait until the finale," he replied, his voice low but confident. There was a tension in the air, one that both of them could feel, but neither acknowledged out loud. The plan was set, but they knew that no matter how prepared they were, something could always go wrong. That's the way heists worked. It was all about managing the unexpected, keeping your cool when things started to unravel. Marion's eyes narrowed as she squinted into the distance. The hair on the back of Nick's neck stood up. He had a sixth sense for trouble, and right now something wasn't right. He turned to follow Marion's gaze, and it didn't take long for him to see what had her attention. In the distance, a pair of headlights cut through the dark, heading straight for them. The glow from the vehicle was like a warning bell ringing in his mind. The guards had arrived earlier than expected. Nick cursed under his breath, moving quickly to grab Marion's arm. "Guards," he muttered, his voice clipped with urgency. "Stay low." Marion's body stiffened, and for a split second, Nick could see the flash of panic in her eyes. She wasn't used to being caught in the act. She was used to playing things safe, to staying on the sidelines. But tonight, she was deep in it just as much as Nick. "What now?" she whispered urgently, her grip tightening on his arm. Nick didn't have time to answer her right away. His mind was already working through the possibilities, calculating the best course of action. The headlights were growing brighter, and the sound of the vehicle's engine rumbled in the air, a sign that the guards were getting closer. Without a word, Nick pulled something from the inside of his jacket, a flare gun. Marion looked at it, her eyes wide. "A flare gun? You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, disbelief in her voice. Nick didn't respond immediately. He was already positioning the flare gun in his hand, his fingers wrapped around the trigger. He knew the plan was risky. Creating a diversion was always a gamble. But with the guards approaching, it was their only option. Marion's eyes flickered between the flare gun and Nick, her expression tense. "What's the plan?" "You fire that thing. We're going to be seen for miles." Nick nodded, his gaze still fixed on the approaching headlights. He wasn't worried. He'd done this before. A diversion was all about timing. Create enough of a spectacle to pull the guards away without drawing too much attention. It was risky, but in a high-stakes situation like this, the reward often outweighed the danger. "I fire it, and we move fast," Nick explained in a low voice, his tone confident. "The flare will distract them. They'll think it's something else. We'll take advantage of the confusion." Marion's expression was hard to read, but she seemed to understand. She nodded once, her breath steadying as she followed his lead, getting ready to sprint if the plan went off without a hitch. The vehicle's headlights were now close enough that Nick could make out the figures of 2 guards in the front. They were still far enough away for them to make their move, but not for long. He checked his watch. 5 seconds. That's all he needed. He aimed the flare gun carefully, calculating the trajectory. The guards were on a direct path toward the area he and Marion were hiding in. There was no time for second guesses. With a smooth motion, he fired. The flare shot out of the gun, arcing high into the night sky with a brilliant, fiery trail behind it. It illuminated the area around them in a flash of red and orange, lighting up the snow-covered landscape like a sudden explosion of color. The flare burned bright for a moment, a flash of chaos against the still night. Nick didn't wait for the flare to burn out. He grabbed Marion's arm again, pulling her into the shadows as quickly as he could. The guards were momentarily blinded by the flare, their attention drawn upward toward the bright light in the sky. "Let's go," Nick hissed, his voice low but urgent. They moved quickly, slipping through the trees and low-hanging branches that lined the edge of the hill. The snow crunched beneath their feet, but the sound was muffled by the roar of the flare overhead, which continued to burn brightly, casting long shadows across the landscape. As they moved further from the flare's glow, Nick's eyes darted around, watching for any signs of movement. The flare was doing its job. It had thrown the guards off course, giving them a crucial window of time to reach the bulldozers and get to work. Marion's breathing was heavy as they ran, but she didn't slow down. Her pace matched Nick's, the two of them working in tandem like a well-oiled machine. They'd both been trained for moments like this, where every second counted, where mistakes weren't an option. They reached the bulldozer's location, and Nick quickly signaled to the driver to start the engines. Marion was already checking the perimeter, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign that the guards might be recovering from the diversion. Nick knelt down, marking the final spots on his map. They were almost there, so close he could taste the success on the tip of his tongue. But he knew this was only the beginning. The hard part was just starting. "We're in," he said, glancing up at Marion with a grin. "Now let's make sure we don't get caught." She gave him a sharp nod, her expression grim but resolute. "Just don't get us killed, Velvet." Nick smirked, his eyes flashing with determination. "Wouldn't dream of it." As the bulldozer's engine roared to life, Nick knew one thing for certain. This heist was far from over. But with the first move behind them, the odds were just starting to shift in their favor. The flare burned brightly, cutting through the midnight sky like a fiery comet. Its orange light flickered against the snow-covered hills, painting everything in an eerie, almost surreal glow. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The entire landscape seemed frozen, suspended in that single, explosive burst of light. But then, as if waking from a trance, Nick snapped back to reality, his focus sharpened like a razor's edge. "Move it!" Nick barked to Marion, his voice urgent. Without missing a beat, Marion grabbed a shovel, and together they began to work quickly. Snow was piling up fast, but it was never fast enough. The trucks were waiting just a few meters away, their engines rumbling, the drivers poised to take off as soon as they had enough of the precious cargo, snow. "This is insane," Marion shouted over the roar of the bulldozers and the distant hum of the truck engines. Nick's lips twitched into a grin as he heaved a massive load of snow onto one of the trucks. "Insane pays well, Marion." "Keep shoveling," he shouted back, his voice carrying an edge of amusement despite the tension in the air. Marion's breath came in rapid bursts, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She was strong, but this was a different kind of labor, endless, unyielding. The snow seemed to multiply, no matter how much they shoveled. But the clock was ticking, and Nick knew they had only a small window to get the job done before the chaos they'd just created would come back to haunt them. The flare continued to burn brightly overhead, casting shadows on the snow, giving the entire scene an almost dreamlike quality. But the flames were fading, and with it, their precious distraction was on the verge of burning out. Nick worked with precision, not sparing a single glance toward the flare's dying embers. The truck's engines roared as the drivers shifted into gear, ready to take off the moment they were loaded. But then, just as Nick had feared, the sound of boots crunching in the snow cut through the air like a knife. One of the guards, a tall man with a dark coat, emerged from the tree line, his eyes narrowing in the glow of the fading flare. His face twisted into a snarl as he spotted Nick and Marion working furiously. Nick's heart raced, his mind calculated in a split second. The flare hadn't been enough to distract them entirely. One of the guards had seen through it, and now they were going to pay for it. "Marion, we got company," Nick shouted, his voice urgent. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed a shovel and hurled it toward the truck. He shoved Marion toward a snowbank. "Get behind cover. I'll handle this." But Marion wasn't about to hide. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "No. We stick together. We run." Nick hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She was right. They didn't have the luxury of separating. Not now. They needed to move fast, and they needed to stay unpredictable. Before Nick could react further, the guard raised his arm and shouted, his voice cutting through the still night air. "Hey, what are you doing?" In an instant, the chase was on. The guard turned and sprinted toward the others. Within seconds, more headlights appeared from behind the tree line, more guards, all charging in their direction. Nick cursed under his breath. They had no time left. The game had changed, and now it was a race for survival. "Run!" Nick shouted, grabbing Marion's hand and pulling her with him. The two of them bolted, their feet crunching in the snow as they sprinted toward the hills. Behind them, the guards shouted orders, their voices growing more frantic as the chase unfolded. But Nick and Marion were fast, too agile. They knew the terrain, knew the hidden paths, the narrow trails that twisted through the woods. Nick had spent years mastering the art of escape, and tonight it was all coming together. He trusted his instincts, pushing Marion to keep up, urging her to follow him without question. "Left. Now!" Nick yelled, pulling her sharply to the side. They veered off the main path and darted through a thicket of trees, the snow crunching underfoot as they maneuvered in perfect synchrony. Marion didn't ask questions. She simply followed, her breath ragged but determined. But the guards were relentless. Nick could hear them gaining on them, their boots crunching loudly in the snow, their voices rising as they shouted in pursuit. A split-second glance over his shoulder told him the lead guard was getting closer. He could see the shadowy figure, his coat flapping behind him like a dark flag. They were closing in. Nick's mind raced as he led Marion through the winding trails, cutting through the dense woods. He knew they couldn't outrun the guards forever. They needed to lose them, to throw them off the scent. And that's when it hit him, a risky move, but it might just work. "Stop," Nick hissed, grabbing Marion's arm and pulling her behind a large tree. The guards were too close, and if they kept running, they'd never shake them. "What?" Marion gasped, but Nick pressed his finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. The guards were getting nearer. Nick held his breath, listening to the thundering footsteps as they passed just a few meters from where they hid. It was too close for comfort, and his heart pounded in his chest. Marion's eyes darted nervously. "What are we doing?" Nick's grin was sharp, his eyes glinting with a wild sort of energy. "We're about to make them wish they were never born." He waited for the perfect moment, just when the lead guard was nearly at their position, and then he made his move. Without warning, he dropped to the ground and began kicking up snow, creating a makeshift wall of white around them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confuse the pursuers for a few moments. "Come on," he said, pulling Marion along as he scrambled to his feet. "We're not done yet." They weren't just running anymore, they were evading. They were turning the chase into a game, one where they had the upper hand. The guards were on their tail, but with every twist and turn they made, they gained more ground, more time. Nick felt a surge of adrenaline, a deep sense of satisfaction. The chase was thrilling, dangerous, and exhilarating all at once. But they still had to get out of this mess. With the trucks loaded and the snow on the move, their job wasn't over. It was just beginning. As they disappeared further into the maze of snow-covered trails, Nick knew one thing for certain. The heist was far from finished. They might be in the thick of it now, but the game was only going to get more intense. The trucks rumbled into Gasper's facility under the cover of night, their heavy wheels leaving tracks in the deep snow as they came to a halt. The engine's roar slowly died down, and the silence that followed felt almost oppressive. Nick stepped off the truck, his boots crunching into the thick snow as he surveyed the scene before him. He had pulled it off. He had moved snow across hills like it was some sort of priceless commodity. And now the results were in front of him. The snow was unloaded swiftly by Gasper's workers, who seemed almost reverential as they handled the precious cargo. Nick had made sure the job was done with precision, every load of snow placed just where it needed to be. The snow had been the key to saving Gasper's business, and as they unloaded it into the specially designed storage units, there was a sense of finality to the operation. Marion stood beside Nick, watching the unloading with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Her breath hung in the cold air, her face flushed from the cold and the intensity of the night. She turned to Nick, still processing the entire heist. "You actually did it," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Nick glanced over at her with a casual smile, his demeanor as cool as ever. He was a man who knew how to get the job done, and this one had been no different. "It's just snow," he said, his voice light, almost dismissive. Marion shook her head, clearly not buying it. "Just snow? You moved snow, Nick. Across hills, past guards, and without getting caught. It's insane." Nick's smirk deepened. "That's what makes it art, Marion." He adjusted his coat as he turned back toward the trucks, the sense of accomplishment settling in his chest. He'd pulled off the impossible, and now it was time to collect the reward. Gasper, ever the showman, clapped Nick on the back with a hearty laugh, his wide grin a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere of the heist. "Snow that saved my business," Gasper exclaimed, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "You're a genius, Velvet. I don't know how you did it, but you pulled it off." Nick gave him a nonchalant shrug, as if this kind of thing happened every day. "It wasn't that difficult," he said, though he knew that Gasper was thrilled. The snow would allow him to continue his business, to stave off bankruptcy for at least another season. This was more than just a job to the businessman. It was his lifeline. Nick's eyes twinkled with an almost mischievous glint as Gasper continued to express his gratitude. "You know," Nick said, "I prefer artist to genius." Gasper looked at him with a confused smile, not quite understanding what Nick meant. "Artist, huh? Well, whatever you want to call yourself, Velvet, you're the best in the business." He chuckled, his voice carrying a tone of admiration that Nick didn't often get from his clients. Nick grinned, a playful glint in his eye. "Snow is a medium just like any other," he said, his voice light. "It's all about shaping it into something valuable." Marion crossed her arms, still processing everything she had seen. The heist, the chase, the narrow escapes. It was a whirlwind of insanity that had come together in a way that even she hadn't fully expected. But now, standing in the safety of Gasper's facility, it felt like just another job well done. She turned to Nick, a sense of wonder in her eyes. "You really did make it look easy," she said, her voice almost admiring. Nick shrugged again, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he leaned against one of the trucks. "Easy? Nothing's ever easy, Marion. It's all about planning and making sure everything falls into place. You can't leave anything to chance, especially with a job like this." Marion couldn't help but laugh, though there was still a trace of disbelief in her tone. "You're unbelievable, Nick. You're talking about moving snow like it's just some small errand you ran." Nick didn't miss a beat. "Well, it was just snow." The exchange was lighthearted, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. This job had been dangerous, risky on more than one occasion, but they had pulled it off. The guards, the chase, the near misses, everything had come down to this moment. And for Nick, this moment was as much about the thrill as it was about the payout. Gasper, satisfied with the job and eager to move on, motioned for Nick to follow him. "Come inside, Velvet. We'll get you sorted with your payment." Nick followed Gasper, Marion trailing behind them, her steps slow but purposeful. Inside the facility it was warmer, though still not exactly comfortable. Gasper led them into a small office, where a stack of bills sat waiting on the desk. The money was neatly arranged, the weight of it almost tangible. Nick's eyes flicked toward the pile, and for the briefest moment, he allowed himself to feel the rush of success. Gasper counted out the money, sliding it across the desk to Nick with a wide grin. $20,000, just like we agreed." Nick didn't even blink as he took the money, his fingers moving expertly to tuck it into his jacket pocket. The cash was a nice bonus, sure, but it wasn't why he did what he did. To Nick Velvet, it was never about the payout, it was about the challenge, the game. The artistry of pulling off something that no one thought possible. "Pleasure doing business with you," Nick said with a wink, his tone smooth as silk. "I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon." Gasper chuckled. "I hope so, Velvet. Maybe next time you can help me with something else, if I ever get into another mess like this." Nick smiled, nodding slightly. "Maybe," he said, his voice a mix of amusement and calculation. He was already thinking ahead, already planning his next move. "But for now I'm done. I've got other things to do." As they turned to leave, Marion followed Nick, her curiosity still piqued. "So, what's next for you?" Nick glanced over at her, his eyes twinkling with that familiar, mischievous glint. "Who knows," he said with a shrug. "The world's full of opportunities. Just have to pick the right ones." As they stepped back into the cold night, the snow still falling softly around them, Nick felt the satisfaction of another job well done. He had outsmarted everyone, Gasper, the guards, and even the unpredictable weather. And in the world of high-stakes heists, that was as good as it got. Nick stood by the door of the facility, his suitcase packed and ready to go, the hum of the snowplows and machinery still echoing in the distance. He had completed another job, and although it had been risky, the thrill of it all left him feeling satisfied. The snow had been moved, the business saved, and the money was in his pocket. Everything was as it should be. As he adjusted his collar and prepared to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the familiar name lighting up the screen: Gloria McAllister, the journalist who had once suspected him of being more than just a petty thief. She was a persistent one, always poking around, always digging for a story. He answered with a grin. "So, how was your vacation?" Gloria's voice came through the speaker, teasing, but with that hint of curiosity Nick had come to expect from her. Nick chuckled, leaning against the cold steel doorframe. "Cold but profitable," he said, his tone light, almost amused by her question. He could picture her on the other end, no doubt with a raised eyebrow, but he wasn't about to spill all the details. He'd learned long ago that a little mystery was essential when dealing with people like Gloria. There was a pause before she responded, and Nick could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. "You know, stealing snow isn't exactly legal," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. He could sense the shift, the moment where Gloria stopped playing the role of the inquisitive reporter and started taking this job of hers a bit more personally. Nick's lips curled into a grin. "Who's going to believe that, Gloria? Snow doesn't leave fingerprints." He let out a soft laugh, knowing full well that her journalistic instincts would be itching to investigate further. But it was all in vain. Who would ever believe the story of a thief moving snow? The absurdity of it made it all the more genius, in Nick's mind. He was practically untouchable. On the other end, Gloria was silent for a moment, processing his words. He could almost feel her frustration building. She had always prided herself on getting the truth, unearthing the stories that no one else could find. But Nick Velvet was a different breed. He was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "I swear, one of these days, Velvet, you're going to get yourself caught," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and exasperation. But even in her frustration, there was an admiration there too, one that Nick didn't miss. Nick's smile deepened. "Catch me if you can, Gloria," he teased, knowing full well she would never stop trying. He had always been a step ahead, always a move or two ahead of everyone else. It was his art, his craft. He didn't steal for money, or fame, or even the thrill. No, Nick Velvet stole because he could, and because no one ever saw him coming. "All right, Nick," she finally sighed, the sound of typing in the background indicating she was already moving on to her next story. "But mark my words, one day, I'll crack you wide open." Nick leaned back, savoring the playful tension in her words. "Good luck with that, Gloria. Let me know when you figure it out," he said before the call ended with a familiar click. As the phone went silent, Nick tucked it into his pocket, his smile never faltering. He glanced once more at the snow-covered facility behind him, the work done, the danger gone. His gaze shifted forward, and he stepped into the night, pulling his coat tightly around him. But as he walked toward his next adventure, he knew something had shifted. Gloria would write her article, Nick Velvet, the Snow Thief of Montreal, and the world would know just a sliver of his story. Maybe, just maybe, she'd get close. But no one would ever truly understand him. With a final glance over his shoulder, Nick disappeared into the night, already plotting his next big job. Because for him, there was always another heist on the horizon.